Hello, friends, and welcome back to this week's episode of Artist Questions. This is the mostly weekly live stream where I look at some of the biggest questions facing contemporary artists in the art world today. My name's Dan Curtis. I am an artist, an educator, and head of education at Exchange Art, which make all this possible. Thank you again for joining me this week, and this is the second in a three-part mini-series called Smashing Imposter Syndrome, and it's all about the idea of imposter syndrome and how it works for artists and how we can break it down to get our best selves out there, really, and make the art that we want to make. This is episode 2, and last week, as a little recap, we looked at the idea of what imposter syndrome actually is, where it came from. We learned that it was coined in the 70s by Pauline Roan Clance, and Suzanne Imes to describe studies they were doing into high-achieving women who felt like frauds despite of the evidence of their success. And we learned from a really cool paper by Walker and Saflowski that it's the subjective experience of perceived self-doubt in one's abilities and accomplishments. And we learned that particularly that is compared with others on the one hand, despite evidence to suggest the contrary. And we looked at a lot of sort of ideas around imposter syndrome, why you might feel imposter syndrome as an artist in particular. And we looked at some cool quotes from Art and Fear, from Frankie McNamara and others, and looked again at the idea of capitalism and how it involves itself in sort of siloing us from one another and getting us into these compare and despair narratives. This week, then, we are going to look at the internal, experiential, mental loop that we get in as artists when it comes to imposter syndrome. So we're thinking about what it's really like to be an artist and feel like an imposter, like you are not a real artist, that you are not really part of the art world, that you don't really have value, or that you're not really supposed to or allowed to be there. And then next week, we will go beyond the personal self and looking into our connection with the world around us. And when we might feel that our art doesn't do anything valuable in the world, so what's the point of making it? And that form of imposter syndrome. So that's going to be the next 2 weeks. So today is back to the internal, the mind, the crazy knots that we can get ourselves into as creatives when it comes to imposter syndrome. There is, in studies around imposter syndrome and social psychology, this continuing attribute of imposter syndrome, or imposterism as it's sometimes called, across the board, that there's this feeling that no matter your successes, that you are somehow tricking people into being where you are and to being the person you are. And that even if you have, say, found yourself in a place where there's these societal sort of structures of success, and you are in somehow finding yourself in that realm, and you have, worked your way to becoming like a lecturer or a famous artist or someone like that, no matter how far you get, that you still have not earned the right to be there. While everyone else has, you are tricking people somehow. Everyone else is real. They know what they're doing, whereas you will be found out. And this feeling of being found out, of being exposed, of if one thing happens, everyone will suddenly learn that actually the whole thing was a fraud, is across the board, no matter the level of success of the person, a feeling that is shared when it comes to imposter syndrome. And unfortunately, for everyone, hearing this, whatever stage we're at in our life, there is no threshold that you can cross that makes you feel like you have passed that. There is no moment that occurs that suddenly you do no longer feel like imposter and you feel like you've arrived, something like that. Unfortunately, even the most, should we say, quote unquote, famous creatives feel the same. There's a amazing quote from Maya Angelou where she's talking about how she's kind of played a trick on everyone. She feels like she's swindled everyone, even though she has these incredible books that have changed some people's lives, in the fabric of the way we think about so many things. And even, to use another example, Van Gogh himself was, always in this experience of self-doubt and thinking that at any moment there could be something that reveals it to be this house of cards that's going to fall down. So where does that come from then? This idea that we have not earned the right to be where we are, no matter where we are. And I'm not saying this is like, oh, you've got to be a super successful artist or a lecturer or, have won huge prizes or something like that, because it happens across the board, no matter where we are in life. And of course, as I was saying last week, I want to pull us out of this framework of seeing success only through accolades or it being handed to you by the art world, or now you're a real artist because you've shown this particular gallery or something like that. Because as I'm saying, there is no threshold. It doesn't matter the level of success. This will always be the same. So where does this come from then? This sense that you are tricking everyone. Well, it comes from an idea that was put forward by a psychologist, American psychologist. He wrote about what he perceived to be, the sort of root of this idea of why this feeling of being an imposter and tricking people. And his name was Floyd Henry Allport. And he wrote a book in 1924. So, 100 years ago now. Called Social Psychology, and it was the first kind of the foundation of then what became the term social psychology and the study of it. And he called this experience literal attitude behavior inconsistency, right? And it's now more commonly known as pluralistic ignorance. So let me explain a little bit about what that is. Here's the straight up Wikipedia definition, if you like. This is what you've come to, just to see me read out Wikipedia to you. But this is a good description. So pluralistic ignorance is a phenomenon in which people mistakenly believe that others predominantly hold an opinion different from their own. And in such cases, many people in a group may go along with a view that they do not hold themselves because they think incorrectly that most other people in the group hold that opinion. And Allport, the way he talked about it, he was kind of proposing that actually then individuals often do not act on their personal convictions or values unless they believe that those convictions or values are shared by the people around them. So then pluralistic ignorance is this kind of feeling that what you think privately is completely different to what everyone else thinks, right? And how that shows up for artists then in terms of imposter syndrome is this feeling that even if we are exploring our own area, even if we've become experts in our area in some way, that we assume that our private doubts, our private struggles, our private feelings of being less capable, less able than others are totally unique to us. And we assume that others, because there isn't much place for us to share these feelings of self-doubt, share these feelings of struggle and barriers and what we're finding difficult, we assume then that no one else feels the way that we do. And this leads to this feeling of being an imposter because look, everyone else can manage it. They've got their shit together. They're real artists. They know what they're doing. They know how to experiment, etc., etc. But I can't seem to get it together. And as you can imagine, then there's a great video on this on YouTube you can find out by Elizabeth Cox about a bit of an introduction to pluralistic ignorance. And the one thing that she says about it is that this is across the board in any kind of environment that people might find themselves in. Because we then start to believe that idea about pluralistic ignorance, it stops us sharing our best ideas or applying for things. Like, so say, for example, like as an artist, you're thinking, oh, I can't apply for that prize because that's like way beyond me, that's for like real artists or something like that, and I'm just sort of mucking around. And then I think connected with that, as we were talking about capitalism last week, and this idea of curiosity and play sometimes feeling like an indulgence when we get stuck in thinking that everything we do has to have some sort of immediate value financially, art historically, everything like that. The idea of play then can start to feel like a sort of imposter syndrome as well. Like real artists don't muck around in the studio trying stuff. Even if they're making mistakes, they're turning into genius artworks in the end. Whereas what we're doing is kind of like wasting our time using materials that we don't really understand while all these other artists do understand it, etc., etc. Another issue with this as well, then, in this pluralistic ignorance, is the fact that when, as artists, what we do is inherently vulnerable, right? It is not grounded, as we talked about last week, in these clear metrics of success or career ladder or something like that. Even the processes, it's not something where you can complete a task and it's done or something like that. We're in this constant state of exposure and to our own ideas, to our own fears, to everything that we're trying to understand. And it's easier then to think, because it's got this vulnerability to it, making art and connecting with deep personal ideas continuously, no matter how abstract those ideas are, and being in the moment with our work, it's easier to think then that someone will sort of peer behind the curtain and suddenly say, oh, I found it, I exposed you now, you're not real, you're not good enough, etc., etc. It's easier to think that, isn't it? Because it feels so like a thinner curtain, if you know what I mean. Whereas, we don't have, say, many artists don't have like a structured team or an HR department or a manager, and stuff like that. They're like these sort of reality checks or regular affirmations or things that you can tick off that you've done the correct process, even if you did it a bit shit or whatever. That doesn't exist in the same way. So it's easy for that kind of private self-doubt to build up, to feel so fragile, and also for it to go unchallenged because we don't have this kind of regular interaction with the reality check of saying, actually, you're doing great, you're trying your best, or you've managed to do loads of things like that, etc. And I think in the end, exactly, we'll come to this a bit more in a minute, but exactly like we were saying last week, in the original study on where the term imposter syndrome, imposterism came from, the key thing that they found for these high achieving women, who, by the way, all went to the same university, all worked in the same university, a mixture of kind of lecturers, other staff, students, they're all in the same place and all thinking, I'm the one that's the fraud, even though they all work together, which is fascinating, isn't it? And it's because they weren't connected with one another. There wasn't this communal thing which allows the idea that people believe something different to you and you're unique in your experiences to emerge. And so that's the reason that me and Martha started the Healthy Artist podcast, was just like, we were finding it so difficult to find good stuff around and people from within and without the art world and artists talking about how fucking hard things are, or how difficult it is to make things happen, or how scared you feel and how much doubt you've got in your own work, and the not sure about how to promote yourself, and how, why am I not getting exhibitions but they are, all these kinds of questions. And there didn't seem to be a safe place to talk about that, and so that's why we started it, really. And we found that so much of the messages that we get from people who listen to the podcast, the kind of across the board, the main thing that people say is, I feel like I'm not on my own now in this journey. And that's so wonderful. And that kind of proves the research again that was done in the 70s with these high achieving women, that once they got them in the room together and talking to one another, people were realizing, oh my gosh, I see it now. It's not just me. And that relieved the self-doubt. And if they could do that before they were going into challenging situations, and for us as artists into experimentation and the vulnerability of the studio, if we can get that continual communal top up of understanding that we're not alone in the journey, it will take away that sense of self-doubt, private self-doubt and exposure that we feel in the context of pluralistic ignorance. So underneath another video I was watching about imposter syndrome, someone made this comment, and I just thought it was really telling. It was just a YouTube comment, so I'm just going to read it out. Someone said, and I think this just flows into some really interesting ideas for artists as well. Another thing to remember: you're watching your own movie, but everyone else's highlight reel. I think that's so interesting. You've got to remember that you get in full Technicolor all day, every day, particularly as an artist with like a mega imagination going on and all the ability to have this kind of heightened sense of engagement with stuff all around you all the time. You're getting the full Technicolor director's cut movie of your life, whereas everyone else that you are kind of performing this imposter syndrome with and having this pluralistic ignorance around, you're just seeing fragments. And that, again, it points back to the same thing. You're not seeing the reality of other people's lives. And so it's easier when you don't seem to see other people struggle to think that your struggles are unique to you. Further on from that, Cal Newport, in his book Digital Minimalism, talks about this idea of how social media has exacerbated this. And again, this fits perfectly with the artist's life, because social media is so much of where artists find themselves nowadays in terms of connecting with one another and promotion and stuff like that. Whether that's a good idea is for another episode. And I've done some episodes on social media, and so have we on the Healthy Artist podcast, so go and check that out. But he talks about, Cal Newport in his book Digital Minimalism talks about this idea with social media, that in the past there's this phrase, and if you're not from the UK or English languages, English not your first language, you might not have heard this phrase before, but I'm sure you have an equivalent phrase, which is keeping up with the Joneses, which means that the Joneses are like this ideal family that are next door to you, and that they're constantly performing this amazing life, and you're trying to keep up with them by like buying the nice lawnmower or the best car or having the best holiday and that kind of thing. So you're in this sort of comparing cycle. But he was saying that at least in the past, with the Joneses next door, they might have the nice car and, you know, the perfectly dressed kids and going on the best holiday, but also you could hear the Joneses arguing with one another. So because you live so close, so you kind of knew what was behind the veneer of their life, and you were in this, you could be in this sort of like, it's not necessarily positive, it's like a toxic headspace of like, you know, they're just as bad as me, you know. But and there's some sort of connection there with that idea of the pluralistic ignorance we were talking about, that, you know, at least in the past you could kind of have, you know, the people around you, you could kind of understand that we're all sort of on the same page or something like that. And now we've got things like social media, which are entire like massive mega machines that are completely designed now to hide those failures. It's literally like, if we're watching our own movie and others highlights reel, and that's what it looked like in the past, now it literally is watching highlight reels, like to the literal degree. And not only highlight reels, but highlight reels created in an app that allows you to literally change the way your skin looks, to change the entire lighting in a space, to add music, to cut things perfectly, to have subtitles, like, and, you know, and they are literally called reels, aren't they, on Instagram? It's kind of so hilarious. It's like literally it's telling us what it is, and yet we look at it and think, wow, they've got it together, and so I must be uniquely a failure. And this is what imposter syndrome is like, regardless of your skill level or where you're at in your life. And I think also then that connects with this sort of presentation of art history, particularly in the West, and then what I like to call like sort of the Wikipedia life. You know, when we look at other artists and we see their life as a highlight reel or like a Wikipedia article. Yeah. I'm always fascinated by Agatha Christie's Wikipedia page. You know, Agatha Christie is the most published author in the entire world and most translated. And, you know, only after the Bible is Agatha Christie's books, you know, so huge levels of success. And, you know, obviously she didn't see all of that in her life, but saw a fair amount of it towards the end. But there's a bit on her Wikipedia page which is fascinating, because she got, you know, most of the Wikipedia page is all about her success and her breakthrough novel, and how that began the sort of journey of her writing career, and for her to write around, you know, 90 books altogether, and the success of that. But there's like a paragraph before it which is like early life, you know, or something like that, and it says that she had, I think it's 11 novels rejected. And when you think about it, that passes by in a sentence. 11 novels rejected before she had her breakthrough novel, blah, blah, and that's what it focuses on. And I think it's fascinating to think that 11 novels is like, that's 11 novels worth of time, worth of hopes, worth of dreams, worth of vulnerability, worth of writing and correcting and editing and scheming and planning. Not just one book, which is hard, but 11 books is like, it's unfathomable to me, like the level of vulnerability and work and commitment and just love for writing to keep going. But also that one sentence is all real pain and all real struggle, and we can totally erase that. And we have to erase that if we are going to believe in the myths that are surround imposter syndrome. We have to remove those sections, just like Wikipedia does, or let it pass in a moment, to see this unmediated, unfiltered stream of success, you know. And so it's very, the way everything operates right now is very much about, you know, competing for such small pieces of attention that the success is kind of maximized on like a huge level of technicolor, you know, beyond technicolor into new colors that don't even exist in the universe. There's another line in her Wikipedia page as well, which talks about her being in sorry, I've got cat hairs here, being, you know, oh, then she paused writing to become a nurse during the Second World War, you know, for 4 years, and that passes as well, and you're like, fuck, you know, what was that like, you know? And it like is just there and gone in a moment, this bit of life. In a way, I sometimes want to think, like, when I look back on Wikipedia and Instagram, and I know it's a reel, I know it's a highlight reel because I make them myself. I've seen it, I know how it works, and yet I still believe it. I still believe that people therefore are doing better than me. It's like, how can I be so stupid in so many ways? And it's bring again that as artists, everything feels so much more vulnerable, and therefore, as these apps and these ways of like framing artist life or art history, they speak directly into that doubt about swindling and tricking people. And because of this pluralistic ignorance, we believe in, yeah. But we need to begin unpacking that, you know, and looking at it and reframing it in another way, which is what we'll do now for the rest of this episode. Because in reality, right, the doubt that we feel is not unique to us, even if it does feel unique. It is shared deeply and widely, right? So let's start breaking down some of the illusion and what we could use to begin to do that. First of all, when it comes to the title of this episode, which is Who Cares About My Art Anyway? There's this sense that when it comes to imposter syndrome, that not only like, oh God, like that everyone else is doing so much better than me or something like that, even though that is not true, there's also this feeling of, well, then kind of what's the point, you know? It's not only me, it's like my art, everything about it. Who even cares enough to like begin to interact with it? And what I want to begin to say is, you are not a reliable narrator of your audience. Okay, I think artists often assume that people won't be interested in their work, or that there's some sort of disinterest in their practice, because they imagine, or I guess, or fear, um, that, that because that what you imagine or fear feels more real than the responses that you've actually gotten, which I guess when it comes to things like social media can be like a like, or a heart, which boosts us for a second before falling away. But you don't see the people who did save your piece and look at it. You don't see the people who've got it on like a vision board, or got your website bookmarked, or were so moved when they saw your exhibition, and they just don't know who you are, or not connected with you, or not said anything. Your art has a private afterlife, that you don't get to witness. And I think we need to really be careful when we're like, oh, who cares about my work, to not forget about the way that art is actually operating, which is so often so personal for so many people. But also that can come in an active sense. Because I remember when I was a stage comedian for many years, I did stand-up comedy and sketch comedy with my partner Lizzie and another friend of ours, Ed. And I remember when we first went as a sketch group to the Edinburgh Fringe Festival, which is the biggest like comedy festival in the world, and we were doing a little venue there, doing a run of shows throughout the month. And I had so much imposter syndrome. We'd not done much stage performance at the time. We hadn't like racked up that many shows. The writing was very fresh. We were really learning as we were going. And when I look back on it, it was like an amazing step that we took to go and do that. But at the time, I couldn't see this as like fun experimentation, trying things out, seeing where it was going. All I thought the whole time was, I don't deserve to be here. I'm not allowed to be here. And what it led to, again, with this being not a reliable narrator of your audience, is that there were times after some of the shows where people would come up and say, oh, that was really funny, I really enjoyed that. And I would say, and I did this multiple times, I would say, oh, thanks, yeah, but it was a bit shit and I forgot what I was doing, and yeah, we actually, I wasn't sure about this one today and I mucked it up. And they would say, oh, they'd kind of, their face would change, and then they'd say, oh no, it was good, it was really good, and then they would go off. And I think we talked about it later, and I realized that in doing that, I was really, really discrediting my audience. And I was kind of saying, no matter what experience you've had, I actually don't care about your experience, because I want to choose to believe my own myth that I am an imposter, rather than accept the evidence in front of my eyes, which is someone telling me that they have enjoyed what I've made. And that links to a really great video I watched the other day by Dr. Alok Kanosia. He's a psychiatrist, American psychiatrist, and he runs a YouTube channel called The Healthy Gamer, I think it's called. And he does some really great stuff on there, sort of modern psychology and psychiatry. And he talks about, like, even after like his own talks and stuff like that, that people come up to him and say, Dr. K, that was great, so interesting, I loved it. And in his head, he's thinking, no, they're making this up. None of this makes sense, something like that, right? And so he said, I want you to sort of ask yourself, what are you having to believe about yourself in this moment to maintain the stance that, for us as artists, that your art doesn't matter, that it's not actually real? What story are you telling about yourself? What evidence are you having to sort of shun to keep this narrative going? And also then he talks about the data from the outside, say an audience member saying, I really enjoyed that, is contrary to your belief. And so then you assume that the other person is wrong rather than right. Okay, it's contrary to this myth that you've got going on, which feels so vulnerable and personal. And because, again, of you know pluralistic ignorance, you believe that it's just you that feels like that and no one else, and so you must be right. And what instead can we do is start to assume that the other person might actually be right. And what is it that I need to believe to to understand that they are right. And also, people don't say stuff like, I really enjoyed that, for no reason. Yes, we might go around assuming that everybody's just being nice or everybody's making stuff up. But there's such a toxic way to live. And like I said, with my own audience, I was like cutting them off and cutting them down. And then they didn't want to kind of spend time with me. And I think probably felt quite offended that they had spent time to come up to me, say that they liked the work. And then I'd been like, no, you're wrong. And so I guess we need to ask ourselves the question, or at least this is what Dr. Kanosia is saying, is that what would that person have needed to experience to get to that point to come and say to you, I really enjoyed that? And it would have to be that they enjoyed it, wouldn't it? And so what then can you start to reframe in your own story to say, okay, instead of coming from my imposter syndrome, my art's not worthwhile, I'm not allowed to be here, that person's just making it up, what would they have need to experience? They would have actually have to engage with it, spent time with it, enjoyed it, and come and have the confidence to tell me that. So maybe I'll start to trust in some of that and break that down. Just thought that was a really helpful point. Number two, then, in thinking about who cares about my art, then, I think also who cares, coming back to this idea of what we were just saying with Dr. Kanosia and what we believe, who cares is often can become sort of like a code for, I don't think I'm allowed to take up space. So it's kind of like, who cares is kind of imposter syndrome speaking in disguise. In the end, then, it's no longer about the artwork anymore. It's the fear that you aren't legitimate enough to be someone that others would invest in emotionally. Yeah. But you are allowed. You are, legitimate enough to be invested in. Yeah. And the whole thing, once you start talking with others, you will realize that so many feel the same. And even people that you are invested in yourself emotionally will feel like they're not worthy of investment. And that's when it starts to loop on itself and you see the absurdity. Because in the end, when it comes back to that kind of classic idea of that imposter syndrome being the sort of inner critic of ourselves and us seeing the full movie of our life, and so being able to slam it down from like a full critic's perspective, the problem is that your inner critic is not qualified to measure the impact that your art is having on other people, or to measure the idea that whether you're an imposter syndrome or not. Because in fact, I would suggest that your inner critic, the one who's constantly judging you and making you feel shame, that voice, is not qualified at all in any way for anything. In fact, you are the qualified one as the maker. Yeah, that means that you are not an imposter. Yeah. And I remember In The Artist's Way by Julia Cameron, she has a really good section on the inner critic. And she actually, what she does is kind of, when she hears that voice of like, oh, you're going to make art about this, or you're going to write about this again, or this is not going to work for anyone, no one's going to connect with this, etc., imposter syndrome coming up, she actually gives the critic a name and a character, and she's called her inner critic Nigel. And Nigel's like this really arrogant, what's it called? A theatre critic, who comes in thinking that he's so great and like saying all this shit without having anything backed up properly and thinking that he's better than everyone. And by kind of characterizing her inner critic, she can look at it from a distance more easily and just be like, Nigel, will you fuck off? And the way that I sometimes talk to myself or to the inner critic when I feel it coming up, especially in the studio when I'm trying to do the thinking and judging at the same time, I can turn to my inner critic and say, bro, you're not qualified. And, the inner critic, you talk a lot of shit for someone who does nothing. You don't make anything. You've got no original ideas. Even with all your bullshit that you talk, you don't say anything to like help me move forward then. Or if you've got this critique, then lead me to steps. What you've got nothing of that, and you don't pay any rent, you don't do nothing, you don't pay, you don't pull your weight. It's all me. So you talk a lot of shit for someone who does literally fuck all in life. Yeah. So I think take that if that's helpful to you, then take that on into your own life and talk to your inner critic that way. Um, you know, in the end here as well, I'm not talking about I'm talking about inner critic, this voice, but I'm not talking about deep existential anxiety, depression. If you're neurodiverse as I am, you are going to be dealing with constant barrage of thoughts all the time, and you're not going to be constantly talking to those thoughts as a character. I'm talking specifically about this sort of imposter syndrome, critic around your artwork. If you are experiencing like a much more sort of anxiety and existential dread, then you need to begin on the process of getting support for that. I highly recommend that. Okay. But I hope this for now is like a helpful way of telling your inner critic to get lost is useful, because it's not about sort of curing it. Okay. Because the other thing with imposter syndrome is that no matter where you get to in life, it doesn't go away. It won't disappear. But the important thing here, and maybe this is a way of sort of rounding up today's episode, is that with imposter syndrome, it's about not about kind of curing it or pretending it's not there or telling it to go away and it disappears. It's about normalizing it, or as Julia Cameron does, and this is why it's like characterizing. It helps you to stand back and say, oh, it's that again, rather than this is me and I'm fully broken and in full shame and I do not deserve to be here. By normalizing it and talking with others about it, we can say, ah, that's imposter syndrome. I can hear it. I can see it. Oh, it's that pluralistic ignorance thing. It's that mindset where I think I know, but I actually don't. And I assume falsely because I've read about it now, thought about it now. And that's by normalizing it, you can change the narrative. And that's the key to actually be a narrative. It's a story. Oh, this is just a story that I'm telling myself or that the world tells me. And I remember hearing a really great educator once saying to a classroom of children, talking about, emotions taking over you, and what other people say about you. And she said, if I, point to this child and say they're a triangle, does that make them a triangle? No, it doesn't. If I think in my head, I am a triangle, do I become a triangle? No, I don't. Your thoughts are not you. They don't make you into something, So, I think that's really helpful. And if you can stand back from some of those toxic thought processes and think about them as processes, as narratives, then you're going to be in a much stronger way for thinking about reframing. To finish, then, I want to give you another way of thinking about it as well. There's a book that my son has, which is part of a really amazing series by this brilliant writer. I'm just going to get it up. Yeah, by Tom Percival, his name is. And it's called Ruby's Worry. And it's a kid's book, part of his sort of illustrated series called Big Bright Feelings. And it's about dealing with these kind of mental narratives. And what I find quite interesting about Ruby's Worry is that Ruby is this little girl who suddenly gets these worries coming up. We don't hear about what they are, but it talks about what the worry that she's having. And the worry is kind of characterized as this little cloud with eyes. It's not like a cloud, it's more like a sort of. I'm just going to get the book. Give me one sec. Let me go and get it. The one day I need it, I can't find it. Now I'm like a streamer, who leaves their camera on the rest of the day. Anyway, it's like characterized as a little cloud. And what's interesting is that as the worry grows, the cloud grows around her, and it's like this kind of thing, this weight that's constantly with her, till it's like filling up the whole bus that she's on. She's hardly got any room, and the problem is, because the worry's so large, she can no longer concentrate on anything else. And not only that, it starts to affect the way she relates to everyone and everything. And you can really understand this kind of imposter syndrome myth and narrative growing beside you. But the key thing is here, she sees another kid in the park, and she's had this worry the whole time and no one else can see it. And she sees another kid and sees that that kid has got the same kind of cloud around them as well. And so she sits down and they start talking. And as they discuss these clouds around them, guess what happens? The clouds reduce in size until they disappear. And at the end of the book, it rounds up and saying, sometimes the worry comes back and there's clouds, but now the difference is she knows to talk to someone about it, and then it's not around for very long. And I just found that such a helpful way to think about this idea of imposter syndrome and pluralistic ignorance and everything we've been talking about today. Is this idea that if we surround ourselves with community, we find like-minded people and remind each other that we are all experiencing this, then that is the antidote to pluralistic ignorance, and that is the antidote to imposter syndrome: community. We just did an episode this week on The Healthy Artist about community. So that's up online now on Apple, Spotify, on our website, everywhere you can get podcasts, The Healthy Artist podcast. Go and check it out. And we're talking a lot there about community, and I think you'll find that really helpful. And also talking about some community meetups that we are going to start doing in the new year in London, and things online as well. So go to thehealthyartist.com and you'll see all of our community stuff and our courses and things like that. Because again, if you want to start building that network and smashing down imposter syndrome, finding others who are like-minded is a great way of doing it, and that's what we're trying to build here. So that's it for today. Next week we are going to be talking about my art can't change the world, so what's the point of making it? And looking at imposter syndrome in a wider context in the role of our art in politics and life and the rest of the world. Until then, I hope you have a lovely rest of the week, and I will see you in the next episode. Enjoy the rest of your Wednesday, whatever you are up to. And if you're in London, make sure you're wearing a big jacket today because it's absolutely freezing. Love you lots. Bye for now.